Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this live stream. I'm going back to a live stream here. In this essay, I'd like to talk about how and why communism failed. Now, there are degrees of failure, I guess. You can look at, say, East Germany that did quite well on balance. Out of all the communist countries ever existed, they probably did the best. And then you can look at situations like, say, Cambodia, Pol Pot, and it was a runaway, unmitigated, total disaster. And then there are various grades of disaster in between. Given that East Germany did the best out of all the communist countries, and that wasn't so good, given they did the best, then they're probably the pinnacle of communist, socialist communist achievement. But looking at, say, the bigger economy, and I'll use the Soviet Union as an example here, because they appeared to be, certainly in the 1950s and early 1960s, they looked to be doing rather well. It wasn't quite as good as their propaganda was suggesting, but on a number of fronts, technologically, for example, they were the first nation to put a spaceship in space. They beat the Americans on that. So they did that having stolen a lot of German rocket technology, but nonetheless, they were the first to get up there. So they'd achieved quite a lot in a number of areas. In pure mathematical theory, they were considered to be world leaders and so on. So given that it was a reasonably literate population, a lot of people committed to the communist ideals, or certainly quite a few, not the majority, I wouldn't think, but why did they fail in the end? Was it something that was inherent in communism? Were they a bunch of lazy good-for-nothings there? And so really, we're down to the ideology, because the Russians are now more or less industrious, really, and a lot of other people. Their education was, certainly by the 1960s at least, was comparable to a lot of other Western countries. So the failures and the reason it all fell to pieces in the end were we can trace it back to ideological. So. But we need to remember that they had these very ambitious plans for production in all areas, food production, metal production, coal mining, and so on. All these ambitious plans, and they weren't frightened to dedicate resources to achieving these things, but they were rather brutish about it. Their objective, like all ideologues, they pursue the objective quite doggedly and don't care about a lot of the collateral damage that they do in the process. Something that central planning can never really sort of deal with is something that capitalism does deal with very well. Any investment in capitalism that doesn't produce a return, or where it's failing to deliver any sort of benefit, tends to be dropped fairly quickly, and the money then moves off into more productive pursuit. And this can come down to the micro level. Company A makes raincoats, but company B makes a better raincoat, and they've got better production prices, so they can produce a better raincoat at the same price than the guys down the road can. So the money, the investment, goes into the raincoat that people want to buy, and investment then moves away from the raincoat that people don't want to buy, and that investment capital then goes somewhere else, again searching for a productive pursuit. Now, the price you pay for that is the smart money and the people with the ideas, people prepared to take the risks. They a disproportionate amount of the benefit of that, say designing and manufacturing raincoats, that benefit goes to the guy or the people that had the idea and prepared to put up the capital and run the risk and sweat it up until late at night designing the new raincoat and so on. So that's the price you pay. There are some supranormal winners, to use economic language, supranormal winners in that process, but the amount of wastage is much less. In a communist society, then the amount of relative wastage is much higher, because instead of dropping a particular investment or course of action or a particular plan, It may take them 10 years before they realise that it's not worth it. So they'll pursue a plan for 5 years. If it doesn't produce results, they'll initially assume that it's counter-revolutionary. They'll say, I don't think they really think that. They'd say it's counter-revolutionaries, or people not trying hard enough, or not committed enough, or not communist enough, until they'll blame all sorts of things there. And then that they'll assume they'll go have another go at the same thing for another 5 years, because there's 5-year plans they used to run. Then only then would they say at the end of 10 years, okay, well, gee, this is not working out, we better try something else, or try. So that they were constantly looking at the people, or at some micro fine tuning that's needed. And sometimes it was, by the way, but most of the time it wasn't. So there was a much longer time lag before unproductive activities would be ceased, and then the resources move into more productive activities. Whereas you look at, say, 10 years for the communists, or the Soviets in this case, in a capitalist society, you'd probably change 1 or 2 years maybe, and you'd be off doing something else. So there's a lot less relative wastage in a capitalist society. But again, on the counterbalancing point is you get people that are bigger winners and have more money in their pockets as a result of the sensible, productive, wise investment action that they took. It doesn't mean you don't get things like people hoarding or monopolies or oligopolies. You do, but it still is a much reduced relative wastage. Now, the other thing that the communists sort of never really came to grips with is that if you're going to have price controls, or if you're going to control one part of the entire process, and it could be, say, I don't know, selling bread at a subsidised price or at a fixed price, then as you follow it through to the truck drivers that bring it in, the grain growers, the bakers, the people who make the yeast that gets added to the grain, and people who make the ovens that bake the bread, and you look at all these factors, then once you control at one end of the process, for example, the end price of bread, then you have to go back through all the other processes, because suddenly by controlling the price of bread, you can change the entire economic dynamic of that entire process just by touching on one area. It's all very well to say, well, we're going to keep the price of bread as $1, for example, $1 a loaf, but that means that the baker can't make a profit at $1, then and so either doesn't make the bread anymore or makes much less bread. So then you get the problem where people don't have enough to eat. So when price controls or when the planning process in the communist system was made, instead of solving a problem as they perceived it would, and that'll stopping exploitation, for example, instead of solving the problem, it simply moves the problem around. So the price of bread's controlled, but then the problem moves to bread production or grain growing. Or it moves to the transport, or it moves to the warehousing. So why is the farmer going to store grain in the silos on the farm if the price for grain has fallen so much? Because the end price of bread's $1, so the baker's only prepared to pay so much for a pound of grain, and then the truck driver isn't going to move it because there's not as much money in moving grain. The farmer isn't going to grow the grain, or if the farmer grows the grain, why should they store it? Why not store something else that makes more money, and so on? Or the grain perishes because the truck drivers can't afford to move it, because they'd rather move something else, and on it goes. So once you control one end of the process, you have to actually end up controlling the entire process, right through to the planting of the grain and the farm and so on. So that's the level of planning that has to go into, and that's quite a serious amount of planning. Now, the communists constantly had a problem with transporting things like grain and even things like fruit and vegetables and so on to the marketplace in the cities. It often they would grow enough, but then it would spoil before they could get it transported to the cities and to the markets. So then they had a shortage of refrigerated trucks to move things, and then they would have silos, but the storage of the the fruit and vegetables would occur during a season of storms. So hailstones would damage the storage, and so on it went. And they seemed to be running around, or not seemed to be, they were constantly running around, putting their fingers in the dike, trying to put out the fires, trying to hold back the tide, rather than have a total solution. And the solution was you can't have the price of bread down that low, because that means no one can make any money, no one can meet their targets. Now, the other thing they did, which was silly, was they would have, say, a monetary value or a tonnage value or some other criteria for crop production. But if the price of the crop fell and less tonnage was being transported, then the farmers and all the other people couldn't meet their quotas for tonnage delivered, or value of tonnage delivered. So they then would switch to something else, and then again the grain wouldn't be delivered as hoped. So this was something the communists could never quite master. They were always caught off guard by the effect of what they were doing, and they were constantly trying to play catch up to make sure that the fruit and vegetables, for example, or the grain wasn't spoiling in the warehouses or didn't sit in the trucks. And many times it would sit in the trucks in the hot weather, waiting outside the city, because no one had thought to put on extra resources in the distribution centre in the city, and so on. So there were these constant things going on. The same would be for building factories. Now they weren't shy about just dropping a factory right onto a dirt floor, just right onto the dirt. The economy, because they had like a budget or a plan. They had to get X amount of factories put up, so they did it cheaply. It was quick, it was dirty, it was crap. The products produced were piss poor and all that sort of thing. But at least they met their planning targets, which is the objective. That's, if they didn't, they could be thrown in prison as being counter-revolutionaries or bourgeois enemies of the people and so on. So the objective was to meet your target as stated in the 5-year plan. Now, the only escape was if nobody met their target, and there was often collusion in that sense. Then they couldn't blame everybody. So they would put factories down that, but no thought would be given to how are they going to get rid of the waste. So the waste would be put straight into, say, one of the waterways that would then kill all the fish, and then they had a problem getting the fish, and on it went. They destroyed the fishing industry in that area. Then they had to import more food from somewhere else. Then that required. So the planning was so rigid and tight, and they were so ready to blame people rather than the plan itself, that vast resources were wasted in trying to force the square peg in the round hole and make an unworkable plan work. And that was constantly what they were doing. If we look at some of the buildings that they erected, the apartment buildings, the intention seems good here. They had like these little sort of village township things organised where the supermarket was never more than 500 metres from where anybody lived, and the various facilities were situated so as to make it easy for the people to get there, and the train station was centrally located to here. And in that sense, they did seem to try quite hard, but the roads were put together very cheaply, and there was no incentive to do quality, so the roads would fall to pieces. The apartment buildings were so the walls were so thin that you could hear other people even talking in a low voice. It was that transparent through the walls. So and then there were stories of how people going to the teenage girls going to the toilet could talk to each other through the wall while they were sitting on the toilet and have a conversation. These sorts of things. So these are the reasons why, like in aggregation, these are part of the reasons why communism failed. But there are other reasons as well. There were incentives to work harder for certain jobs, and so you could get yourself quite a decent bonus, really, if you're prepared to work hard. People opted sometimes for piecework. So they could say, well, I made 20 widgets today, and then they would get a bonus for that, and so on. So there was a lot of that going on, but because there was no consumer society as we would understand it in the West, there was nowhere really to spend your money. There was a black market, but people tended to trade favours on the black market rather than money. The local currency wasn't really worth anything to the people who had exotic goods to sell. Maybe they were getting alcohol or blue jeans from the West or something like that, or maybe rock star records or CDs, tapes, and so on. So that so it was more of a favour system in the black market, or if you had US dollars, something like that. But the local currency didn't really cut it. So even if you had additional currency, there really wasn't anything to spend it on. If you started to amass a decent amount of currency, then you came under a lot of pressure from the government to buy government bonds. And if you didn't, you were considered to be a bad communist, that sort of thing. But otherwise, there was no incentive for workers to work hard. And the saying in the Soviet Union at the time was, we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us. So, and they had a system of creating jobs to ensure there was full employment. So they'd create jobs that weren't needed, and really there was nothing for anyone to do. So they would turn up to work, shuffle a few papers around, or they had these sort of make work schemes where you had to do these useless reports that no one ever read. So they had these make work schemes where you'd shuffle a few papers around the desk. It maybe was an hour or two's work a day at best, but you'd pretend to fill up the whole day with this shuffling these papers around. So there was incredible boredom. There was a pointlessness to the work. Why do I bother? What am I achieving? What's the use of me going to work? All these sorts of things. And yet the penalties for not turning up for work were quite high. The exemptions were only if you had a young child or if you were looking after an elderly and sick relative. Otherwise, if you were late even a few times in a row, technically, you could get yourself 30 days in prison for things like that. Repeated offences would be even longer. So these are the things. There was no incentive, and the central planning couldn't work, and the price signals and the market signals that otherwise would be in place in a capitalist society, a capitalist economy, those lack of those signals meant that there was a much higher proportion overall of waste. They would just hang on to loss-making, foolish enterprises for much longer than would happen in a capitalist society. If you look at capitalist societies, particularly where there is real representative democracy, which of course in the West we've pretty much lost now because of the globalists, but you don't really see famines, for example, or huge embarrassing failures in the West. If you do, it's corrected quite quickly. Whereas in communist societies, because the pursuit is ideological, they'll look at all sorts of excuses and possible reasons, such as counter-revolutionaries and things like that. The last thing they'll look at is any failure that's aligned with the ideology, and even then they won't really concede it. They'll assume there was some other thing. When Nikita Khrushchev became premier in the Soviet Union after Stalin died, he got this idea to make the Soviet Union completely independent in grain production, and this was a tall order because the population was over 200 million at the time, but he wanted to, or about 200 million, I think, at the time. So he went to what was called the Virgin Lands. These were areas that hadn't been cultivated previously. Now, the soil was pretty ordinary, and it was going to take a lot of fertilizers and irrigation and all sorts of things, very carefully done. A lot of sections would have to be fallow for years and then be used again. So a lot of crop rotation was needed. But they put a plan in place to just go full bore, bulldoze ahead, regardless of any realities. And they ended up, the soil ended up being so threadbare it couldn't grow anything. They polluted and poisoned the waterways, and it was an almighty fuck up. But the intention maybe was good to do that, but it was just handled so badly, and it was an enterprise that was doomed to not necessarily failure, but a much reduced outcome. Khrushchev was looking at it as being grain independence for the Soviet Union. It was never going to be that. I mean, it would produce more grain if it was done properly, but certainly not enough for independence. Just on the East German example, that it went a little bit better for them. They had a smaller area to manage and reasonably well populated, sort of spread over the area. They were quite an industrious people, very well educated. They had a lot of engineering skills, things like that the Russians didn't have, or other East European countries didn't have, certainly not to that extent. And so you see that just a better quality workforce, and they were more prone during a 5-year plan. Not that they did it all the time, or they were perfect, far from it, but they were more prone to abandon enterprises that weren't working out. But when the West Germany and East Germany came together in the early 90s, the reunification, the East Germans were generally shocked at how wealthy and prosperous the West was, and vice versa. The West Germans were staggered at just how dirty and how basic and threadbare things were in East Germany. So it goes to show that the communists, just how far the communists fell behind the capitalist West, and it was for these reasons that I've mentioned, and some more. I've done a quick pass here. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.